So, when you hear the word research, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, it's probably a straight line, right? You ask a question, you test it, you get an answer. Simple. But what if I told you that's only, half the story? Today, we're going to dig into a second path to discovery, a more winding one, but trust me, it's just as powerful.
Which brings us to this big question. Is all research really a straight line from point A to point B? I mean, we all learned about the scientific method in school, didn't we? It felt like this super rigid, step-by-step recipe. But the reality? Well, it's a whole lot more fascinating and way more flexible than that.
And this right here, this perfectly captures what I'm talking about. On the left, you've got that clear, predictable flowchart. That's our straight path, quantitative research. But over on the right, it's a totally different story. It's a winding, circular journey. That's qualitative research. We're looking at two completely different maps for finding answers.
All right, let's start with the path most of us already know pretty well. We're calling it the straight path, the world of quantitative research. Okay, look at this process. The key word here is predictability. This is basically a blueprint for a building. You start with the problem, you do your homework, you come up with a really specific hypothesis, and then you just follow the steps. Everything, and I mean everything, is planned out before you even think about collecting a single piece of data.
So what really makes this path tick? Well, it all comes down to structure and numbers. You start with a very specific testable prediction, your hypothesis. Then, the entire research design is locked in from day one. And the whole point is to collect numerical data, usually from big groups of people, to see if your theory actually holds water.
But what if you don't have a specific hypothesis to test? What if your goal isn't to test a theory, but to just explore something really deeply? Well, that's when we need to get off the straight path and take the winding one. This is where we get into a different way of understanding things. This is qualitative research.
I love this quote from the source material because it just nails the shift in thinking here. It says, "The progression is closer to a circle than a straight line." Think about that. It's not linear, it's circular. The researcher is constantly looking at the data they're getting and using it to decide where to go next, all in real time.
And here's what that circle actually looks like. See how the steps all feed back into each other? This is the crucial part, collecting data and figuring out what it means. They aren't separate steps that happen at the end. Nope, they happen at the same time. This creates this incredibly powerful feedback loop, where what you learn on day one literally shapes what you do on day two.
Okay, so what does it really mean to walk this circular path? How does this whole flexible, iterative thing actually work? Let's break it down.
This concept is the absolute key to everything, emergent design. So, you know how quantitative work has that fixed blueprint? Well, this is the exact opposite. The design of a qualitative study actually emerges while the research is happening. It's like you're drawing the map as you explore the territory. It lets the researcher follow these unexpected leads and adapt to brand new insights on the fly.
And get this, even something as basic as a literature review is totally different. In a quantitative study, you do all your reading up front, right? But in some qualitative approaches, like phenomenology, which looks at lived experience, or grounded theory, where you're trying to build a theory from scratch, the researcher might actually wait to do all that reading. And you might be asking, why would they do that? Well, it's to avoid having their head filled with existing theories. They want to hear what people have to say with totally fresh ears, without any preconceived ideas.
So, a big question is, how do you know when you're done? When have you talked to enough people? Well, it's not some magic number you decide on beforehand. The guiding principle here is something called data saturation. You just keep collecting data, doing interviews, observing, until you stop hearing new stuff. The moment the themes start repeating themselves and you're not getting any new insights, boom, you've hit saturation. That's your cue to stop.
Okay, this is a really critical difference. A qualitative researcher doesn't just collect all their data and then sit down to analyze it. No way. They analyze as they go. What they learn from that very first interview is going to shape the questions they ask in the second one. It's this incredibly dynamic dance of collecting, analyzing, and adapting, all happening at the same time.
And the analysis itself, it's what's called inductive. So instead of starting with a big theory and trying to prove it, that's top-down. You start with the raw data. Pages and pages of interview transcripts. You dive in, you get your hands dirty, and you start labeling interesting little bits with codes. Then you start grouping similar codes together into categories. And finally, you zoom out and see how those categories form these big overarching themes. You're literally building understanding from the ground up.
Okay, so I know what you might be thinking. If the design is so flexible and there's no fixed sample size, how can we possibly trust the results? How do we know it's rigorous? It's a fair question. And the answer is that qualitative research has its own, very robust system for ensuring quality.
The most important thing to get here is that it's not a lack of standards, it's just a different language for those standards. So where a quantitative study talks about validity and reliability, a qualitative study talks about trustworthiness. This is made up of a few things, like credibility, which basically just means, hey, are these findings believable? And transferability, which asks, could these insights be useful in other situations?
And they have some really cool techniques to make sure their work is trustworthy. There's triangulation, which is just a fancy way of saying you use multiple sources, like interviews and observations to see if your findings line up. Then there's member checking, which I think is fascinating. You actually go back to the people you interviewed and say, hey, I think this is what you meant. Did I get this right? Does this sound like your experience? And finally, reflexivity, which means the researcher has to be really honest about their own biases and document how their own perspective might be influencing the study.
So there you have it. We've walked down two very different paths. One is straight, planned, and predictable. The other is circular, flexible, and emergent, which naturally leads to the big question. Which one is better?
And the answer is, well, it's a bit of a trick question. Neither is better. They're just designed to answer completely different kinds of questions. This table is a great cheat sheet for the key differences. Quantitative is all about testing hypotheses with large samples and numbers. Qualitative is all about exploring meaning with smaller, super insightful samples and looking for themes. It's really not about which one is better or worse. It's about choosing the right tool for the job.
And that right there is the unique superpower of the winding path. Quantitative data is great at telling us what is happening, but qualitative research, it gives a voice to actual human experience. It lets us dive deep into the why and the how behind the numbers, giving us this rich, textured understanding that you just can't get from a spreadsheet.
So let's end on this thought. The straight path is absolutely essential. We need it to measure the world of facts and figures, but to truly understand the complex, sometimes messy, and often beautiful world of human experience, a world that, let's be honest, almost never moves in a straight line, well, for that, we absolutely need to know our way around the winding path.